Well, we heard last week there was a rumor that the federal government was preparing an oil and gas bailout package, and it was going to be delivered in short order. It didn't happen last week. It now appears that it won't happen this week, but it will happen next week. And so the question I'm going to be talking about with energy journalist Shawn McCarthy today is, should the big oil sands companies be bailed out? So we're talking Suncor, Cenovus, CNRL, Imperial, and Husky, and maybe even Mega Energy, which is a smaller producer, but nevertheless. So welcome to the interview, Shawn.
Thank you, Markham.
Okay, well, let's make this really simple. Do you think that if the federal government bails out the oil and gas industry, that it should bail out these large and lately very profitable companies?
I don't know what a bailout for them would actually look like. I would say on the face of it, no. There might be some areas where there could be some backstopping or some support for technology development or so on. But the federal government has supported the industry by keeping a pipeline alive. When it looked like it was going to die, I'm sensitive to the fact that these are extraordinary times and it's a major industry. And, if we really thought these industries were going to go bankrupt, then perhaps, but, accruing a whole bunch of losses. And then, when we get back into profitable times, writing those losses off down the road as they've done through cycles immemorial is typically the way we go. And I see no reason that they can't pile up losses now and then come back and they'll be writing them off for the next decade if this goes really badly.
I'm going to argue the pro side in this conversation, basically that they should, with qualifications, of course. But let me throw some support your way for your no side. And that is that we've had a downturn fairly recently in 2015, 2016. The big companies weathered the storm. They did okay. Yes, they lost some money, but they survived quite nicely and repaired their balance sheets. And last year, they returned to their shareholders an extraordinary amount of money. And so they actually are well positioned, or as well positioned as you can be, to survive a price war.
Yeah, and I think you touched on something here that's really been sort of bothering me through this whole, and it's not just the oil sands companies, frankly, it's corporate Canada in general. Conrad Jakuboski in the Globe yesterday had a piece about Air Canada and about all the share buybacks the company had engaged in over the last couple of years. And then now they're asking for a big bailout, so where is the responsibility of a corporation to prepare itself for tough times? Now, nobody predicted, very few predicted, maybe Bill Gates predicted the kind of pandemic that we're seeing. So I recognize that, you have to take that into account, but to say that we should just do some sort of a TARP, I'm not even sure. Really, people in Calgary want the federal government to buy shares in the oil companies, and they then act as a shareholder and require, these big companies to make investments or to do something with their production that a shareholder might decide on. I don't think the Calgary oil patch would like that, and I'm pretty sure Jason Kenney would.
Well, that's a very good issue, because I interviewed University of Houston economist Ed Hurst last week, and he said, look, if any government is going to put money into a project or into a company like this, it has every right to attach strings to it.
Absolutely.
And there were strings attached to the equity support for the two automakers last decade. And there's no reason why there couldn't be some sort of strings attached. And the strings, I use the example, I'll be writing a column about this. Suncor, when it last week delayed its $300 million solar farm by 2 years and its $1.4 billion cogen plant by 2 years. And those are all designed to electrify processes and drive down emissions. And it's almost like the emissions are the first thing to go. And I don't think the rest of Canada will look very kindly on that if they're come asking for money.
Exactly. I mean, it's one of the areas where, that it struck me certainly that the first thing that went were these projects designed to lower emissions. They were supposed to have a payback, and they don't have a payback yet when, WCS is $5 or whatever it is today. So understood. And the need to conserve capital, understood. But I suppose the argument would be then if the federal government did come in with any kind of support, and that's a very contentious argument, but say they do, and it looks like they're going to, that support unlock some of these projects or support. We talked about post bitumen beyond combustion and projects, all sorts of technology projects that are out there that no oil company is going to be spending money on at this point in this crisis. So, maybe there's some opportunity there for the federal government to grease the wheels there.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And in fact, this is where I come in now on the pro side of the argument, supporting a bailout if necessary. And that is because I know that there, Zipporah Berman and the environmental groups out on the West Coast, whenever they talk about the oil sands, they talk about fossil fuels. And I'm convinced now that we're going to see peak oil demand sooner than we thought we had. And the market for fuels is going to begin to decline faster than we thought it has. But the question then becomes, is there a post-combustion demand for the oil sands? And you mentioned the Bitumen Beyond Combustion, which is a program by Alberta Innovates. And I interviewed one of their experts, and he said that they are 5 to 7 years away from commercializing the production of carbon fiber. And they would be able to do it at about half the price of carbon fiber today. And I think that if that is the case, if there's a future like that for those oil sands companies, then we best make sure that they don't start falling like dominoes here.
Right. Well, and maybe there is and maybe there isn't. I mean, we hear a lot about technological promise that keeps getting put off on the horizon. So, I'm a little bit from Missouri on that. Show me. But you talked about the underlying market and the demand that may not come back to pre pandemic levels, and if it does, it'll take a long time probably, and then we have other pressures, climate related pressures in terms of new technology and EVs and so on. So I think again you have to be pretty careful, and I know this is a tough pill for people in Alberta to swallow and will hate me for saying it, but if this industry is not going to see growth in demand but is going to see it declining, maybe we get back in the short term to some growth prospect, but within 10 years, most are seeing declines in demand. Then bailing out companies that are expecting growth and planning for growth seems to me to be maybe not the best way to go about it. And again, we're already financing now two pipelines, the federal government with Trans Mountain and Alberta with KXL, and those are pretty big subsidies.
Well, let's talk about that. I interviewed Jiang Sun, who's an analyst with an advisory company down in Houston. He's an expert on the heavy crude oil market. And he said that, I asked him very plainly, is Canada a low-cost producer of heavy crude, which is bitumen? And he said, no, Canada is kind of in the middle of the pack, but it enjoys a comparative advantage over competitors because of its proximity to markets. So that would be the U.S. Southwest, some in California, and the most down in the U.S. Gulf Coast, as well as, a Canadian oil company owned refineries in the U.S. as well. Yeah. And the big unknown factor here is what happens to Venezuela.
Right.
because Venezuela has fallen from 2.1 million barrels a day to under 400,000. It was reported earlier this week. And that's been a huge advantage for Canadian producers. If Venezuela comes back on stream in any significant way, that could put a lot of pressure on markets down in the Gulf Coast that Canadian producers are counting on. And it's just an unknown. We don't know what's going to happen with that.
Right. And I appreciate the argument from Calgary that, we have climate measures that other countries don't have, and we'll see with Venezuela. I mean, they may come back and have zero regulation and just pump it out as fast as they can and not have to deal with and that lowers costs, and they can outcompete, and that's difficulty. The Canadian producers would like to see some recognition in the market that there is, they brought their carbon intensity down and so on. I think the only recognition at this point you're getting in the market is the benefit to your own operating cost and to some degree capital cost by bringing, most of the carbon intensity that they brought down has been also cost reduction. So kudos for them on that. And if they can keep it up, if they can keep bringing their costs down, maybe they can remain competitive, but it's against everybody squeezing costs here, and it's not everybody else isn't staying the same as the Canadians try to lower their costs.
To some extent, Shawn, the industry has been hoist on its own petard here, because the way to fix that issue of, say, Venezuela not worrying about its emissions and Canadian producers having to bear the extra cost is, of course, to put on some kind of carbon pricing that would affect imports into the Gulf Coast. Now, that's an American issue, not a Canadian issue. But the Canadian industry has been pretty supportive of Donald Trump and the American industry's outright opposition to carbon pricing. And even in, now the oil sands companies are a little different, but the industry in general in Canada has been opposed to carbon pricing. So it's very difficult when you've been this opposed to misaligned on carbon pricing for this long to suddenly then argue at some point that you want carbon pricing on Venezuela because it's advantageous to you.
Well, I would actually disagree with you there. I think most of the, I think, yes, there's been a general, especially among the independent and the developers in Alberta opposed to carbon pricing, whereas the oil sands companies have not been. I think if the U.S. had gone the direction that it was headed under Obama, and if, say, Hillary Clinton had been elected, there would have been much the competition from the shale sector. If there were carbon pricing applied there, you can accept more carbon pricing in Canada because the playing field's a little level. I think what you're getting at really, and we may see this more under a Democratic administration if one, if depending on how things go, if we have an election in November, that it's, carbon tariffs and climate tariffs that would punish importers who do not face carbon, any kind of climate regulation. And in that case, Canada could be an advantaged producer if the producers in Alberta, have carbon taxes and other regulations, whereas those, in Saudi Arabia and Venezuela do not. That could become a competitive advantage.
Well, thank you very much for this, Shawn. I think this is a fairly thorough review of the big issues anyway, when it comes to the bailout of the big five, big six oil sands companies in Alberta. And I guess we'll see what the federal government comes up with next week.
Yeah, well, I will guess we'll see if it's next week or the week after. These are hard decisions to make, right? And you have to. I think everybody's reassessing constantly how bad this is going to get, and talk now of Trump trying to bring the Saudis and the Russians together to cooler heads prevail on price war could make a difference as well.
Well, Shawn, thank you very much, and we
All right,
look
Mark.
forward to
Good to
chatting
talk
with
to you.
you after the bailout package is announced.
All right, sounds good. Take care.